Viewer discretion is advised. The following contains details from an ancient text that was once accepted and then quietly removed. They weren't supposed to come here. And once they did, something went wrong. Not eventually, not slowly, immediately. Long before the Bible was finalized, before the councils decided what stayed and what disappeared forever, there was another text, one that had already been circulating for centuries, one that people were already reading, already referencing in their own sacred writings, already quoting, already afraid of, and most people today don't even know it exists. Most people believe the Book of Enoch is just mythology, an old story that didn't make the cut, something rejected because it was too strange, too crazy, too uncomfortable for the people who decided what Scripture looked like. But that's not why it was removed, because inside, it doesn't describe something watching from above. It doesn't describe distant, abstract powers. It describes something coming down, not symbolic, not metaphorical, descending to this earth, to this world, to us. And what happened after they arrived is where things start to break. At first, when nothing seemed unusual, just a forgotten text, something historians mentioned in passing, a footnote at the bottom of a longer story, a reference inside another document. Easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, easy to forget, and for a long time, that's exactly what most people did. They filed it away under mythology, grouped it with other ancient texts that didn't quite fit, and moved on. Until someone actually sat down and read what it said. Not summaries, not commentaries, the actual text. And that's when it started to feel different. Not wrong, just too consistent. Because the Book of Enoch isn't vague. It isn't poetic in the way religious texts sometimes are. It doesn't leave much open to interpretation. It lists names. It lists specific events. It describes a sequence of things that happened in a precise order that makes sense. It reads like a record. Structured, specific, intentional. Not a vision someone had in a dream. Not a parable designed to carry a moral lesson. A first-person account, written as if someone was present. Written as if someone needed future people, to understand exactly what happened. And there's something about that quality, that specificity, that level of detail, that makes it feel different from other ancient texts. Less like storytelling, more like a testimony. And what it testifies to is where things begin to shift. Before this goes any further, you need to understand who Enoch was, because without that, none of this makes sense. In the Bible, Enoch appears in the book of Genesis. Briefly, a few verses, he's listed in the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and then something unusual is said about him. Most people in that genealogy died. The text records their lifespan and then says, and he died, but not Enoch. Genesis says Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. That's it. No death, no burial, no tombstone, just gone. And that alone should raise a question. And that single unusual detail, he was taken, is what makes Enoch significant. Because if you take the Book of Enoch seriously, it explains where he went and what he saw when he got there. The Book of Enoch describes Enoch being taken on a journey, shown things, told things, given access to information about what had happened with the Watchers, what was going to happen to them, and what all of it meant for humanity, and then sent back to deliver a message to the Watchers, a message they would not want to hear. Think about that for a moment. A human being sent to deliver a judgment to the beings who had descended to Earth, who had given humanity forbidden knowledge, who had fathered the Nephilim, and the message was simple. There is no mercy for you, no appeal, no forgiveness. What you did cannot be undone. That's the role Enoch plays in this text. Not a prophet predicting the future, a witness, a recorder, someone who saw what happened and wrote it down. And what he wrote down is what we're still arguing about today. But that wasn't the strangest part. The text opens with a group, beings described as the Watchers, not demons in the traditional sense, not the angels most people picture, robed figures with glowing wings standing at the edge of clouds. Something more specific, something with a clearly defined role. The Watchers were sent here specifically to observe humanity, to watch from a distance, to study, nothing more. And this is where things get unsettling. They weren't sent to interfere. The text makes that explicit. The assignment was observation only. Observe, do not act, do not engage, do not intervene. Just watch. And for a while, they did, until they didn't. Now think about what that implies. It implies there was something worth watching. It implies humanity was already being monitored, already considered significant enough to have beings assigned specifically to us, already under surveillance, long before we understood what that might mean. And for a time, they did what they were sent to do. They watched silently, from a distance, observing how humans moved, how we thought, how we built things, how we fought, how we loved, how we suffered, learning everything about us. And this is the part no one talks about. If you watch something long enough, you start to understand it. And if you understand it long enough, you start to feel something toward it. The text implies that the watchers, over time, developed something: desire, connection, something that made the rule, do not interfere, harder to keep. And then one of them, a leader named Semjasa, made a proposal, and 200 of them agreed. They came down together, descending onto a mountain called Hermon, which means whatever happened next was not a mistake, not an accident, not a moment of weakness by one individual. This was coordinated, deliberate. 200 beings don't descend to one location without planning, without communication, without a collective decision to break a rule that apparently was never meant to be broken. And what they did after arriving is where everything starts to fall apart. Because they didn't just arrive, they began teaching. And here's what most people misunderstand about this part. They picture ancient mysticism, sacred ceremonies performed at dawn, secrets whispered by firelight, abstract spiritual wisdom passed from one hand to another. That's not what the text describes, not even close. The knowledge that the Watchers transferred to humanity was practical, specific, immediately applicable, the kind of knowledge that changes everything, immediately. A Watcher named Azazel is specifically credited with teaching men how to make weapons, swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the full architecture of warfare. He also taught women the art of cosmetics and adornment, but the text frames it as something more unsettling than beauty tips. How to use appearance as manipulation, how to use beauty as a tool, how to shape perception. Other Watchers taught enchantments, the cutting of roots, early chemistry, some scholars argue, astrology, meteorology, the signs of the earth, the signs of the sun and moon. A complete curriculum, a transfer of knowledge so specific and so complete that the text treats it as the origin of human capability in these areas. And this is the part most people miss. It doesn't describe humans developing these skills through centuries of trial and error. It doesn't describe gradual discovery. It describes a handoff, a deliberate transfer of knowledge from beings who came from somewhere else directly to early humanity, which should feel uncomfortable. Because if that's what actually happened, then the question isn't how humans learn to do things. The question is why those things were given to us. Was it an act of compassion? Was it curiosity? Was it something more calculated? The text doesn't give a clean answer, but it does describe the result. Humanity received weapons before it had the wisdom to restrain them, received the art of manipulation before it understood the damage it would cause, received knowledge of the stars before it understood its own nature, power without restraint, capability without readiness. And the text treats that as the source of everything that collapsed afterward. Not human weakness alone, not human evil. Human capability handed over before humanity was ready to carry it. But the knowledge wasn't even the worst part. If you're still here, you're starting to see why this was removed. Subscribe to The Silent Scream if you want more stories like this, because something else happened after the Watchers came down. The text describes offspring, children born from the union of the Watchers and human women. And before you categorize this as ancient mythology and move on, read what the text actually says about them. Not fully human, not fully whatever the Watchers were. Something between, something hybrid, something that didn't have a natural place in this world. The Nephilim. The text describes them as enormous, 300 cubits according to some versions, approximately 450 feet. Even scholars who take the text seriously treat that as likely symbolic. But the point isn't the exact measurement. The point is what they did. They consumed everything. Fields stripped, animals gone. Nothing left to grow. The Book of Enoch describes them working through every food source available to early humanity. When the food ran out, they moved to the animals. Birds, beasts, reptiles, fish, consuming everything. And when the animals were gone, they turned on each other. And when that wasn't enough, they turned on humanity. The text describes a world in rapid, accelerating collapse. The structures humanity had built before the Watchers arrived couldn't survive what came after them. And here's the detail in the Book of Enoch that rarely gets discussed in any retelling of this story. The text says the earth itself cried out, that the sound of what was happening on this planet reached somewhere beyond it, that the suffering of the animals, of the humans, of the earth itself was so significant that it became a kind of signal, a distress call, a plea, and that signal was answered. And there's something else the text describes that most retellings leave out entirely: the flood. You know the story, Noah, the ark, 40 days and 40 nights. One of the most told stories in human history. But the Book of Enoch adds context that changes how it reads. According to the text, the flood wasn't simply a punishment for general human wickedness. It was a response to something specific: the Nephilim, the collapse they caused, the suffering that had reached beyond this world. The text frames the flood as the cleanup, the attempt to undo as much as possible what the watchers had set in motion. And here's the part that makes scholars uncomfortable. The flood takes care of the Nephilim physically. Their bodies perish, but the text says something else about what they leave behind: their spirits. The Book of Enoch describes the spirits of the Nephilim as becoming something that wanders, something that afflicts, something without a body but not without presence. The text says these spirits go out and afflict humans, causing sickness, causing violence, operating on the earth, in the air, in the spaces between things. And they don't stop, they persist, which means the flood didn't solve the problem. It changed its form. And something that changes form doesn't end. The Nephilim as physical beings, gone. The Nephilim as something else, still here, still present, still operating. That's the part the text says no one talks about. That the consequences of what the watchers did didn't end with the flood. They just changed shape. And if the text is right about that, then what the watchers set in motion over 4,000 years ago never actually stopped. Because the text doesn't stop at the destruction, it describes a response, a judgment, something beyond this world noticing what had gone wrong and deciding to act. And here is where the Book of Enoch does something unusual for an ancient text. It gets specific. The watchers aren't condemned as a faceless group. They're named, individually, one by one. Semjasa, who led the descent. Azazel, who gave humanity weapons and manipulation. Armaros, who taught the releasing of enchantments. Barakijal, who taught astrology. Kokabel, who taught the constellations. Tamiel, who taught astronomy. Ramiel, who taught the signs of lightning. The text names 20 leaders in total, and each one is assigned specific accountability. This knowledge, that consequence, your responsibility. Like a formal indictment, like something that was meant to be on record. And the sentence they receive is the part most people don't expect, because they weren't destroyed. That's the detail that changes the entire story. They were bound, imprisoned. The text uses language that sounds almost geological, cast into the darkness of the earth, buried under the valleys, sealed away. Not in some abstract spiritual prison, here, on this planet, beneath its surface, held there until a day of judgment that, according to the text, is still approaching. Not gone, not eliminated, not destroyed, just contained. For now, which means whatever they were couldn't simply be undone. Their existence was not reversible, only manageable, only controllable. For now. And that raises a question the text deliberately leaves open. What happens when the containment ends? And that raises a much bigger question. So why was this book removed? That's where most people start. And most people assume the answer is simple, that it was always on the fringe, always rejected, always considered too strange, too dangerous, too far outside the boundaries of what religion was willing to accept. But that's not what the historical record shows. Not even close. The Book of Enoch wasn't hidden in a cave that no one found for centuries. It was circulating, widely. The Book of Jude, which is in the Bible, quotes the Book of Enoch directly, verses 14 and 15, almost word for word from the 7th chapter of Enoch. The Epistle of Barnabas references it, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria. Some of the earliest and most influential Christian writers knew this text, and many of them took it seriously. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, explicitly defended the Book of Enoch as scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found near Qumran in 1947, contain more fragments of the Book of Enoch than almost any other single text, which means it was being copied, studied, preserved, treated as worth keeping. So when did that change? The shift appears to happen somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries, the same period in which Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, the same period in which councils were formally deciding what counted as scripture. And somewhere in that process, the Book of Enoch was quietly set aside. No dramatic moment, no single council vote that history has clearly documented. Just a slow, deliberate drift toward exclusion, and then finally it was gone from the canon. Not destroyed, not burned, not declared heresy, simply excluded, left out, by people who had clearly read it, who clearly understood what it claimed, and who made a deliberate choice to leave it behind. What changed? And here's what makes this even stranger. The Book of Enoch was never truly erased. For over 1,000 years, the Western world had almost no access to it. It was treated as lost, referenced in other texts, quoted in documents that people were still reading, but the original itself nowhere to be found. Medieval scholars knew it had existed. They quoted the pieces they could find in other documents, but the full text? Gone, until it wasn't. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned to Europe from Ethiopia. He brought with him 3 complete, intact copies of the Book of Enoch, perfectly preserved, because the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had never removed it. Not in the 2nd century, not in the 4th century, not ever. They had kept the Book of Enoch in their biblical canon for over 1,500 years, treated it as scripture, read it in their churches, passed it from generation to generation, as if it belonged there, as if there was never a question about whether to keep it. While everywhere else in the world, it was gone. While the rest of the world was told it didn't exist, one community had been reading it the entire time. And that contrast is important, because it means the exclusion wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the obvious conclusion that every religious tradition independently arrived at. It was a decision made in specific places, by specific people, at a specific time, a decision that a different community simply never made. Not destroyed, excluded, selectively. One more thing worth considering. When James Bruce returned to Europe with those 3 copies in 1773, the academic world didn't exactly celebrate. Some scholars dismissed the text immediately. Others debated its authenticity for decades. A full English translation wasn't produced until 1821, 50 years after the copies arrived. And even after that, it remained on the edges. Studied but not embraced, discussed but not elevated. If this text had been returned to the world and found to be clearly fictional, clearly nothing worth taking seriously, why did it make so many people so uncomfortable? Why did scholars spend decades arguing about whether it was authentic? Why not simply read it, file it under ancient legend, and move on? Unless there was something in it that didn't feel that simple. And that makes everything feel intentional. Because if this was just a story, why remove it at all? Mythology doesn't get excluded from canons. Folk tales don't require councils to decide their fate. Fiction doesn't get quietly set aside while being referenced in the text that replaced it. You only work to suppress something if it carries weight, if it raises questions that don't have comfortable answers, if it challenges something that someone very much needs to remain unchallenged. And look at what this text actually claims, that there was a time before written history when beings came to this planet, that they weren't supposed to, that they gave humanity knowledge it wasn't meant to have, that the consequences of that transfer were catastrophic, that what followed, the Nephilim, the collapse, the suffering, was significant enough to be noticed beyond this world, that a judgment was issued, that those beings were condemned, named, punished, and then buried. Not destroyed, contained, still present, still here. According to the text, still waiting for a judgment that hasn't come. Why erase it from the canon but allow it to survive somewhere? Why keep it in Ethiopia but remove it from Rome and Constantinople and Alexandria? Why reference it in Jude but leave out the original? There is no clean answer. No moment where a council says, this is exactly why we excluded this text. Just a slow drift toward exclusion, and a text that somehow survived anyway. There's something worth sitting with here. The Book of Enoch describes a world that broke, not from ignorance, but from knowledge given too soon, from capabilities handed to a civilization before it was ready, weapons before wisdom, power before restraint, and the text frames that as the source of everything that collapsed. Not human weakness alone, not human evil, human capability handed over before humanity was ready to carry it. Now look at the world today. Technologies appearing faster than our understanding of them. Capabilities developing before we've decided whether they should. Tools being handed to humanity faster than we can determine their consequences. And ask yourself whether the Book of Enoch feels like ancient history, or whether it feels like a description of something ongoing, something we're still living inside. The text doesn't answer that question. It was never meant to give you comfort. It was meant to give you a record of what happened, of what was set in motion, of what has never fully stopped, and of what is still, according to the text, waiting. Or maybe the removal itself is the answer. Not to hide it completely, just enough to make it disappear. Maybe someone read this text, understood exactly what it was saying, and decided that certain things were not meant to be understood, not meant to be questioned, not meant to be remembered. The Book of Enoch was never completely lost. It's still here, still read, still studied by scholars and theologians and historians who aren't entirely sure what to do with it. Still sitting in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, right next to the books that made the cut in every other tradition. Still quoted in texts that billions of people read every single week. The references didn't disappear just because the source did. Why were the watchers watching? What did they see in humanity that made them decide to come down? What exactly was the knowledge they transferred, and where did it go? What are the Nephilim, and what does it mean that the text describes their spirits as still wandering? What does it mean that the watchers themselves are described as bound, buried, waiting for a judgment described in future tense? A judgment the text says has not yet arrived. Which means if you take the text at its word, we are still in the time between what happened and what the text says is coming, between the original transgression and its final resolution. The watcher's still somewhere beneath this world, still contained, still waiting, not gone, not destroyed, just held. It survived the councils. It survived the exclusions. It survived over 1,000 years of being called mythology, being dismissed, being buried alongside the text itself. And it's still here, the same text, the same names, the same account, exactly as written. And if it was removed for a reason, then maybe it wasn't meant to be read. So what do you think this really is? A story or something we were supposed to forget? Let me know what you believe in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to The Silent Scream, hit that like button and turn on notifications, because this isn't the only one, not even close.